Right, we want to start the story of devolution, I suppose, at something that we could call the beginning.
Parliament that we propose would have a stable financial base. The assignation of revenue raised in Scotland will provide a degree of certainty in a system where resources will still be pooled nationally and distributed on the basis of need. Our critics constantly refer to a tax-raising Parliament. It would be as fair for me to talk about a health service improving or a better education Parliament. I know of no Parliament that does not have such a power.
This country has for nigh on 300 years prospered as part of a strong United Kingdom. The power to increase domestic taxation locally and in terms of business. The power to marginalise this country, and particularly the power which will be used by the SNP and others to drive us down the road to separatism.
We've put a scheme which I believe has internal coherence, which offers stability, which has a logical division of responsibility between Edinburgh and London, and we're going to deliver it. That's what we've been asked to do by the people of Scotland. We took the whole question of consent head on, and we've had a resounding endorsement. The Labour government's policy is now the people's policy, and we are going to make sure that we have that Parliament up and running and elections in the first half of 1999.
Scotland does not need to choose and should not be forced to choose between separation and no change. That there is a better modern way forward. There is a third way. That way is devolution within the United Kingdom, and today Scotland has said that that is the way that Scotland wants.
Well, it is an absolute privilege to be joined by someone who was side by side with Donald Dewar, who you saw there, the father of devolution. Please welcome former Labour MSP, former Scottish Labour leader, and former special advisor to Scotland First Minister Donald Dewar, Wendy Alexander. Hello. Have a seat. Thank you so much. Wendy, it's lovely to see you. You're the first to try sitting on the sofa there alone. Is it okay? We're worried about this. My admin's terrible. I over-ordered or under-ordered on the sofas. I can't be sure. It's great to see you. I think one thing that almost goes without saying, but we need to talk about, is that you are our closest link to Donald Dewar, really, in so many ways. And clearly, it would be wonderful if he had been able to be here, but such were those tragic early years of devolution. I suppose I just want to ask for some reflections from you on 25 years since devolution and your time spent with Donald Dewar.
Sure, so I was listening to Fergus. I think I'm here because I intend to be dead by 50 years. So this is the one chance to do kind of oral history. And we are losing people, so, you know, congratulations for the event.
Oh,
I think...
Thank you.
Donald hated to be deified. I mean, he could be dour and difficult, as everybody who worked with him or knew him can be. But I think it is fair to say he was the right man at the right time in the right place. And he was, Fergus alluded to it, there was a set of devolutionists and across all parties in the early 70s, of which Donald was one. And then there was another set in the late 80s, early 90s, of which Jack, Susan and I were all part as well too. And Donald, you know, he believed in Britain, but he was a powerful advocate of Scotland. He had friends across all parties. He was a funny mixture of a kind of Crosslandite social democrat, but he also had a strong kind of Gladstonian liberal streak in him. He was hugely friendly with Neil McCormick of the SNP. He understood the he was a cultural nationalist. I don't intend that to be the soundbite, but Donald was the right person at the right time. And I think it's fair to say, when you look back, the Constitutional Convention created a framework, but of course it didn't do the detail. And Donald's gift was to make the right calls on the big decisions that have given us stability as an institution. And those big calls were, yes, we're going to have PR, yes, we're going to reserve to Westminster everything that's not devolved to Scotland to let it grow and prosper. Yes, we will have direct influence in Europe. Yes, we will reduce representation at Westminster so there's parity to deal with the West Lothian question that loomed large. And on a whole range of issues, how we, relationships with the Crown, with Concordats, all of that, he made a big contribution in an incredibly short period of time. And I think it's also fair to say, and Henry will speak to this, is that it was very controversial when the Labour Party in 96 said we think there should be a referendum to entrench, if you will, the powers of the Scottish Parliament. And that was a tough, tough call. It was promoted by Derry Irving because he'd looked at the experience of John Smith trying in the late 70s to get legislation through Westminster, and they thought the only way we can think of the Rwanda, I was talking to Jackie, who was voting for Rwanda yesterday, or against the Rwanda flights. If you think of that House of Lords phenomenon, the decision was, we need to make clear this is the settled will of the Scottish people. So what it essentially meant was that into power at the beginning of May 97, within 11 weeks of white paper, a referendum by September, and that blunted the opposition from the Lords and Whitehall that might have followed.
I want to, I suppose, just consider the atmosphere of the time, both kind of politically, I suppose, in the country as well. I want to play just a short bit of Tam Dalyell and George Robertson, just for a bit of a sense of the mood of the time.
We will go down a motorway to a separate state, a journey on which many of us don't want to embark.
If you have an institution that calls itself as a parliament, they want more and more and more.
A Scottish Parliament inside and strengthening the United Kingdom would kill the SNP, because the majority of people in Scotland want control over their own lives, over domestic affairs, but they don't want to wrench Scotland out of the United Kingdom.
What was that like being in the Labour Party, knowing that actually, I think people look back and perhaps don't realise that there was unanimity across you. There was actually internal factions that you had to overcome as well. And I just wondered if you could give some insight into that particular experience and making sure that you were bringing your colleagues with you, because we know that perhaps Tony Blair wasn't the most positive about devolution at that time as well.
Yeah. So I think by the time we got to the election in 97, the Labour Party had agreed that there needs to be a Scottish Parliament. Yeah. But there will be a Scottish Parliament, and it wasn't signed up to every dot and comma of the convention scheme, because they'd be busy doing other things. And so Donald had to fight a lot of that line by line. I think there was a recognition in the Labour Party, and to the pessimists in the room tonight, I think, what's the counterfactual here? Scotland had been administered for 120 years, and we'd had a kind of taxi full of Tories, as we talked about, in the 90s, running Scotland. I mean, the counterfactual of not having a Scottish Parliament would just have been a democratic affront, and you'd look to all of the major European nations move towards decentralisation. And I think the challenge we have now is, power to the north in England, the modernising of the British state remains one of the greatest challenges for the devolution settlement. But to answer your question, and I will let other colleagues do it later on, I think the Labour Party was signed up to the institution, but I think the party did on occasion struggle to adapt, because we had the Labour Party was quite a centralist organisation, and that process that others will comment on played out over the subsequent 20 years. I mean, one of the things was, and it's still being reinvented, what is the role of a Secretary of State for Scotland? And I think, coming back to what Nicola the polling that Mark and Nicola showed, is you have to go back now. I have two 18-year-olds, and I think it's one of the reasons I came out of politics, to spend more time with them. They will both now vote at the general election and the Scottish election. But I think the analogy of the Parliament being a teenager is right. And a bit of an unruly teenager, I think, but thinking of it as just being a teenager is a good way to think about where we are on the journey. And I think the Labour Party took a while to adapt, but my kids were one when we last had administrations in Holyrood and Westminster who embodied Donald's vision of devolution, which was, let's have the best of both worlds, let's work together, and the electorate will decide whether it thinks that working together gives us a better potential to move on in the near term than what we've had, because we're at a time where just after 17 years in one place and 14 in another, there's a bit of weariness around. But I ask others about the Labour Party's struggles to adapt. I
will do.
I think it's a fair point. We signed up to the institution. We struggled more with the implications for it as a party.
And you mentioned just earlier on, and we'll take some of these other views just now, actually, when we bring some more people on in a second, but you mentioned that Donald wanted to put some of the core building blocks in place, which made me wonder, did he have a pretty set vision of where it was going to go had he had a more extended time in office, which obviously would have planned to do? Did he have a view of what that evolution would look like, or was it more ad hoc than that?
So I think, Donald always said devolution is a process, not an event. Alex sought understandings in order for the SNP to join the campaign for the referendum, that there wasn't, I think, glass ceiling, is that right? There was no ceiling on the aspirations, and those undertakings were given on the floor of the House. So I think Donald, and if you ask Donald candidly, he would have said, I'm a lawyer. I wanted to get the basic legal framework right, that let it be a new power in the land, as he said at the opening speech. He was really the first to admit that, for example, on the financial powers, he knew they would have needed to evolve and change. So he was comfortable with seeing it evolve. I mean, one of the most interesting areas, which of course is now transformed by Brexit, is that the convention had nothing to say on how the Scottish Parliament would relate to Europe. And so it led to the European Communities Act of 1972 having to be amended, and Scottish ministers having the right to join council minister delegations, all that sort of thing. So I think Donald was comfortable with it being a process. The only thing I would say, and my Labour colleagues will, our journalistic colleagues, fundamentally Donald never wanted to be father of the nation. I mean, that was partly because, look, he was First Minister at the height of New Labour, where everybody was perfectly coiffured and looked apart, and Donald hated media management. We used to say, he'd a shape that Marks and Spencers had never thought of, and he wanted to be in a minibus in Drumchapel, whereas, Alec wanted to be on a helicopter on Crestonfield Heights. Alec was doing the
I was in that helicopter, by the way.
So Alison was saying, damn it. So Donald was so deeply unfashionable in how he rose to being a national leader. He just wouldn't play by the rules. And so therefore when he died, so suddenly, I actually think it was an outpouring of grief, including by the journalists, for how they treated him in office. And so he didn't want to be father of the nation. He wanted to be a Labour minister committed to social justice, dealing with poverty in, Annie's land. I mean, that's what he was about. But he died too early to have done. I won't bore everyone with the litany of what he said he started, but that is he was both the Gladstonian liberal, but really he was a Crosslandite social democrat. He would always say, how do we right the social arithmetic? And it is a tragedy that he died too early to be able to see that through.
Wendy, stay there, because we're working our way through the years. We want to add to the conversation a former First Minister.
And the simple message that I want to give out is this: Scotland works better when Scotland works together. History will judge us harshly if on Thursday we fail to ensure we get the double yes vote that has been called upon today.
Well, we're very pleased indeed with the first two results. It clearly indicates that Scots have welcomed the opportunity to choose the future, and we've received substantial endorsements on both questions. It augurs well for the rest of the evening, and I think it augurs well as well for the future of Scotland in terms of getting the bill through the House of Commons and getting on with the business of electing a parliament.
You yourselves have talked about raising tax for specific issues like education.
Yeah, and well, we will see what happens in 2 years' time once we get beyond the first set of elections to this parliament, when we see what its complexion politically is like. And
could I just mention that polls seem to suggest that Labour might be able to get in a majority in this parliament, polls running tonight?
I don't
without
think
needing the Liberal Democrats at all?
Yeah, I think we're really jumping ahead of ourselves. We've only had 2 results at this stage. Let's see what the overall result is tonight.
80% of Scots voted for parties that wanted constitutional change. That was the first step in the process. We now have the referendum. Again, the 3 major parties have worked together to make sure that Scotland's interests were put high up on the political agenda. I think people have liked seeing a new type of politics. They've seen this consensus emerging over constitutional change. That doesn't mean that when we come to elections for the Parliament, we won't be fighting our corners to ensure that we get maximum representation. But that said, the real tragedy of tonight is that once again the Conservatives are isolated.
Well, please welcome Henry McLeish. Henry, thank you so much for being here. Henry, of course, was First Minister from October 2000 to November 2001 for the Labour Party. Henry, how remarkable was it that Labour won in 1997 on a platform of devolution for Scotland, and then you followed it through in 99 with the referendum, and it was onwards. The Scottish Parliament emerged.
Well, I think as Wendy has been hinting, this was a remarkable period in Westminster politics. I mean, never has a white paper of such quality been produced, largely due to Donald Dewar, because he had big battles, even at that point, with some of the big beasts at Westminster who were not as enamoured with devolution as we were. But Donald fought his ground, and I always remember the situation when he would come back from these committee meetings they held every week to discuss the details of everything that was happening in Scotland. And Donald would come back in that laconic way, never a great enthusiast or a great comedian, and shaking his head, thinking he had done badly. But actually what had happened when the civil servants came back just said that Donald wiped the floor with these big beasts. And that, I think, illustrates how much he put into this. Because as Wendy had said, that was an amazing year. You're elected. You have a white paper on the referendum. You then have the white paper. You then have the referendum. Then you have the Scotland Act. And then with a constitutional steering group, all within 2 years. And I think it's absolutely right on an occasion like this, and I think Wendy's done that, is to say that Donald's performance was absolutely beyond what you would expect from a normal cabinet minister at any level, because he actually epitomised the best of Scotland. He was at home reading the back pages about Celtic and Rangers as he was talking about any cultural aspect in Scotland. And you know what? That allowed him to understand what was happening. Not just a cold, clinical politician putting legislation through, but actually someone who loved the country, who was immersed in the country. And as I've always said with Gordon Brown and Donald Dewar, anyone that starts reading about football in the back pages, I'm 100% behind. But I also think that the occasion was not lost on anybody. And Donald, when he was opening the Parliament, made the point that, the debate will not stop when the doors of the Parliament are open. And that was a key message that maybe few of us have taken on since then, because he often expressed the view, Wendy, the genie's out the bottle. And he knew that the future of the country would largely be on what Scots wanted. And 25 years later, it's remarkable that we are actually discussing now how devolution can be taken forward, but it was part of the legacy that he bequeathed.
Yeah. Amazing. One of the things you said there, actually, in one of the clips, I think actually from Results Night itself, was about this new era of kind of consensus politics, which I know was such a driving force in the establishment of the Parliament. And I just wonder if you would offer a reflection on that 25 years on.
Yes, I mean, it's not the most positive of reflections because, we thought we were being geniuses at Westminster. We'd devise a system that nobody could really exercise authority at the expense of other parties. It never worked out that way. And I think that was a great weakness, because I always believed, now to be fair and honest, when I was at Westminster for 15 years, I was part of the rabble there. I would abuse people verbally and would shout and behave like football hooligans. Once removed from that, then you're actually looking at it in a very, very different way. So consensus, we haven't had. We had consensus when all that legislation was going through. And one of the things that worries me these days, and it's happening in America, it's happening in Europe, it's happening here. When I was there, we used to talk about political opponents. But we now talk about political enemies. There is no trust. There is no respect. And any unifying ideas for the future of Scotland have largely disappeared. Now, that is not a singular aim at one party, but to me, the politics of hope at Westminster at that time was to say, hey, let's do it differently. Let's have a horse shape, because that's what they do in Europe. Let's not have two sword lengths apart like they do in the House of Commons, with two red lines, where in the past they used to duel if they couldn't come to an amicable arrangement within the Parliament itself. Now, that hasn't happened.
Can I come in there, Henry? Sorry, very quickly, because what you just said there struck something with you. This wasn't what I was originally going to ask, but I remember in 2008, the financial crash happened. We were, as a Scottish Government, going out to Kentucky to sign the deal on Gleneagles hosting the 2014 Ryder Cup. And Alec called on you to come out and help and represent the Scottish Government, and you gave two cracking speeches. Jim Mather was there as a minister, but was absolutely fine having Henry do the speeches. You brought the house down. I think we did one at Brookings Institute in Washington, D.C., and you did one in Kentucky with the whiskey, I can't remember what it was, North American Whiskey Association. And we had a cracking week. We did. A lot of fun. A lot of hard work as well, honestly, on behalf of but I suppose my question to you is, based on what you've just said, therefore, is, you know, would Nicola Sturgeon ask a Henry McLeish? Would Nicola Sturgeon ask a Jack McConnell to do that? That's not personal. I think this is about the climate within. Would Humza do that? Is it almost seen now that we're so seen as political enemies that it has made the environment toxic, more than conducive to collaboration?
Yeah, I mean, accepting that, what I never told Alec after that was that I had an amazing bout of vomiting for 2 days. It took a while to recover. Now, whether that was some kind of SNP disease or illness.
That was me, Agent Aberdein.
I never worked it out. But the serious point at issue is that I just want more respect, more trust, more unifying purpose within our politics. And it is true to say, because, look, and let me make a harsh political point here, that I believe that from 2014, with Alec leaving, the nature of politics changed in Scotland. And I think today that the nature of that change has meant that there is no unity of purpose in Scottish politics after 25 years. We are more divided now than we've been in the last 25 years. The idea of having a divided public is clearly important. The other issue, of course, is that one party has so dominated the Parliament, in my view, to exhaustion at times. That's not moving forward either. And what we've got to realise is that Scotland may be at the point where people in most parties agree that something different is required. And that comes back to this idea of consensus. You know, a lot of people say, well, consensus is a lot of BS. You know, we're passionate, we're powerful, we want to do this, we want to do that. None of this namby-pamby. But you know, this Westminster is an example of so-called powerful government. What a mess Westminster in. First past the post. Now, my view, for example, just one throwaway, is that we, in fact, elect 73 of our MSPs on first past the post. Why don't we look at the idea of going for proportional representation for the whole of the Parliament, as they've done in Europe? The list system is prevalent. So it is an idea that we need to look at ourselves, and there's no point in looking at Brexit and saying what a mess, looking at Trump, what a mess. The danger in Scotland is that we just lose respect. And at the end of the day, I think, Wendy, you made that point, it was to serve the people of Scotland. And if we accept that, then that's a good way to go forward.
We're going to keep the conversation going as we welcome Lorraine Davidson, who in May 1998 became Director of Communications for the Scottish Labour Party under Donald Dewar. Let's welcome Lorraine to Holyrood Sources. Great to see you, Lorraine. Thank you for being here. I like that we're uniting everybody from this kind of period of history. It's great. Lorraine, a thought from you then on that time. So you joined in 1998. Obviously, you were running up to 1999. What was it like? What was that atmosphere at that time?
Febrile, I think. You know, it's easy to look back now and think it was always inevitable that Donald was going to become the First Minister of Scotland, but when I sort of took on that job, I think what people...
Do you know what? Hold that thought. Just take a slip. Thank you, Scott. Go on. So it's febrile.
So febrile, and then I think as I took on that job, sort of day one, what people forget is that actually Mr Salmond was doing incredibly well. The SNP were actually really, really strong at that point, and it wasn't looking as inevitable from the winning of the referendum to what we were looking at in terms. There was a real wobble within the Labour Party of what's suddenly going wrong here. And I mean, Donald at the time was, I think, in terms of the Labour Party in London, obviously, there was Millbank, they were absolutely ahead in terms of messaging and control, and Donald was seen by, I think, the Labour leadership and those around it in London as somebody that didn't quite get it, didn't quite get modern politics, didn't get modern campaigning, didn't get the art of the soundbite. So they felt that what was going wrong was that Donald wasn't signed up to that sort of Millbank way of doing things. And actually, nothing could have been further from the truth. I think he was a bit portrayed as behind the times when actually he was way ahead of the times. He, you know, the old adage about the relationship between journalist and politician should be a bit like dog and lamppost. I think Donald actually believed that as a Democrat. So I think he thought, we shouldn't control the media. The media have a really important job to do, and as politicians being held to account by the media will make them stronger politicians and will make the policy process stronger. So it was an intellectual distaste for, it wasn't that he didn't understand the message and the machinery of all of that. It was kind of as an intellectual and as a towering figure in politics, he didn't really believe that was how politics should be done.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and to come back on the consensus point that Henry made as well, as we look at the campaign and then through into the Parliament, it's interesting what you say about consensus, and it'd be interesting to get everybody's views, and Jim's in fact in a second as well. I worked for McLetchie at the time, for David McLetchie from 2002 onwards, and we certainly felt there was a consensus because everybody hated us. So that was the consensus.
It's nice that you bring people together.
It was interesting, and Liz will remember back in the day, on free personal care in particular, there was a really big argument inside the Tory party at the time because the Tory party and David felt he had almost no choice but to back free personal care.
Rightly so.
Because of what it would look like if he didn't, and how much it would entrench that feeling that the Tory party was the outlier that didn't want the Parliament in the first place and was now in it, and just couldn't, you know, I think David and those around him felt that really what they had to do was try to actually put themselves into the consensus that you're talking about. Did you ever think that he was in it?
I suppose one of the fears that each party had was they didn't want to be doing something that would be out of kilter with what their Westminster colleagues might be thinking. And one of the great issues about free personal care, which I'm grateful to say I was involved in, was that it was dismissed as a ridiculously expensive item. You know, we shouldn't do this. I had to visit London and have battles with various people about it. And the issue was not so much failing to get involved in a consensus, but we were doing things differently. Because I basically said to the Chancellor at that time and the Prime Minister at that time that I really couldn't care whether they liked it or not. We had the legal opportunity to do it. It was going to be right. But I do think that sometimes the Labour Party was affected by the same problem you've talked about. Should we be doing this? It's about money. It's about everybody. And I kept reminding people about free personal care. You know what? Here's an interesting story about the National Health Service. It's free at the point of need. So what's your difficulty? So I think the consensus issue was a difficult one to get onto, for people to get onto. But it was new as well. I mean, this was in 2000, 2001, 2002. And I think, maybe Jack will speak on that later, but this was a Scottish idea, made in Scotland, for Scots. But I do think there was reticence in other parties to be associated with something which, too expensive, to this, to that. That degree of difference was not captured.
So, I was going to say I don't buy this, so let me just say that in the sense that I think there were 3 or 4 things going on historically. If you look at the forces behind the convention, they were people who wanted participative democracy, very often people who were not part of a political party, and they felt greatly disappointed that representative democracy of parties became part of the census. That was one thing. Secondly, and Brian Taylor's written about this, the press, as Lorraine has hinted at, the Fourth Estate has a role, which is to, oppose and challenge and report. And they kind of felt they had been so corralled into supporting devolution that actually when they finally got a damn thing, their historic role was actually to be pretty robust. And there was a red top war going on in Scotland at the same time. So one, you have all the disappointment of the people who believed in participative democracy. You have all the fury of the press. You have Donald's personal ambivalence about not wanting to be a party leader, which he hadn't done before, and a parliamentary leader and a national leader. This was a man who did not crave those three roles. They were thrust upon him, and most other political leaders want them all. So that was all part of the mix. I think Jack, in his leadership, was trying to hold that vision together. And I think if you come back to the Parliament, and frankly, as the person on the receiving end of First Minister's questions from Alec, it did not feel like, nor what properly. Politics is about a battle of ideas. So I think where we are now, if you go back to this is a teenager growing up, I think, and I'm going to say this because I have my red coat on, I'm a Labour supporter, I actually think, as someone who is also probably didn't vote in the first parliamentary, Annis's attempt to constantly say, I don't care what you think is the destination for Scotland, I just want you to be with me on the next part of the journey, because after 17 years, anybody's tired. Now that feels to me like at least the beginnings of getting back to saying, let's get beyond some of the incredible partisanship, which wasn't any individual's fault.
Yeah.
Trying to decide whether you're staying in a country or leaving it, by definition, the world over, is a pretty polarising experience. It just is. And so one of the bits of Scotland being stuck is trying to think how, without pretending we all agree, can we focus on execution? Because if Alec and I seem to be saying, with a huge civil service machine, but it can't get anything done. And that would be I'm sure, Kate will come up and talk about that. So I think we're beginning to develop a more sophisticated understanding of where consensus is appropriate, what the challenges are.
Just before, hold that thought for me, Henry, because I want to just finalise the era, if you like, by welcoming a former Deputy First Minister to the podcast.
What we are arguing for, Donald, is that if you do bring government closer to the people, then you are more likely to get decent decisions. It is a Conservative government at Westminster that took away from local authorities in Scotland water and sewerage services, that took away from most local authorities in Scotland further education. And what we're wanting to see is returning power to people in their nation and in their communities. Jonathan, thank you very much. I think these results exceed expectation. I mean, we said, look, Scotland had an opportunity and it should have the self-confidence to grasp it. That's precisely what we've done. And, the Scottish Parliament couldn't get off on any surer footing than what we've got tonight. I mean, the Scottish Parliament, by the very fact that it's going to be elected by a system of proportional representation, those who are elected to Parliament are going to be obliged to find a much more cooperative spirit than anything we see at Westminster. And that's a lesson that Westminster is going to have to come to terms with too, because I think the public will recognise what actually can be done when parties establish that there's common ground and can build on it. Now, it doesn't mean to say the party battle is going to disappear. There's still going to be differences.
Jim and myself can confirm that agreement has been reached between Labour and the Liberal Democrat groups in the Scottish Parliament.
This historic agreement will ensure that Scotland's first Parliament for 300 years will make a difference for all of the people of Scotland.
Well, please welcome Jim Wallace. In the run-up to this, I described it to everybody as I wanted it to feel like Question Time meets the Graham Norton show, and I feel like I'm the one who's been tipped off the chair, but it's fine. It's all good. Jim, thank you so much. It's great to see you. Thank you for being here. We saw you and Donald Dewar there signing the first coalition agreement in the Scottish Parliament. How easy or difficult was that for you?
It was a challenge to get it over the line.
Yeah.
I think there was an expectation that that might happen because the system of PR made it less like 2011 was the exception, that any party would get an overall majority. And I think, again, there was an expectation that it would be a Labour Liberal Democrat coalition. But it was never a given. And we had some pretty tough negotiations, as Henry Wendell will remember. And the tuition fees was a big issue. There was other things too, which like Skybridge tolls and beef on the bone, something we forget now. we wanted to end the ban on beef on the bone, and it was and there was more than one occasion. I closed my folder and said, Donald, we've given it our best shot. I don't think it's going to happen, but we'll be a responsible opposition, and we'll play events as they come. And we persevered, and we eventually found a way forward, which led to the committee under Andrew Cubey. And we were then able to actually get an agreement. I was able to bring the Liberal Democrats on board, and we got an agreement. There was one occasion I remember, because we had little groups, working groups, and they would go away and they would go through our respective manifestos and would see where we had agreement, and they would write. And then there was areas where we didn't have agreement, and they would put in brackets. And then it was put up to the full negotiating team as to resolve these areas of non-agreement. And there was one, I can't remember now what it was, some in the energy stuff. And Donald read the stuff out and said, where is this liberal nonsense all about? And I said, Donald, that was from the Labour manifesto. In fairness, he saw the funny side of it.
Jim, can I ask you, you were part of that first coalition, and actually it was a bit of a test case, and it went pretty damn well, all things considered, in terms of the coalition government in that first Parliament particularly. And yet your colleagues down south tried that out as well in 2010. And I suppose I'd be really interested in your observations on, one, a question, did they actually seek your advice, somebody that's actually done this before in coalition? And secondly, what does it mean for the potential for coalitions going forward? Because if the polling is to be believed, the Labour Party might need the Liberals again. They might need another party, but I'd just be interested in your observations on that. And finally, if I may, just for Lorraine, just on top of that, and if you come in the back of it, how did it feel being a Labour Party advisor, all of a sudden having to deal with a new party as well at that time? Please, Jim.
The answer to the first question is yes. They did seek my advice, and I was sort of involved in some of the negotiations. Not the front line. It was dealing with some of the crossing the T's and dotting the I's stuff. But I think where there was a mistake made, because the one that did for us was, we had difficulty here over tuition fees. We had tuition fees south of the border. But actually the coalition agreement at Westminster actually gave the Liberal Democrats an opt-out. We were not obliged by collective responsibility, and for some reason we agreed with what has to be said, the Secretary of State, who happened to be a Liberal Democrat, Vince Cable, proposed. And we didn't take the opt-out that had been given us. And the other thing, I think, which was, all right, there was differences in numbers, it wasn't hugely different. But I would never agree anything with Donald, or subsequently with Henry or with Jack, unless I was confident I could carry my troops with me. And I'm not sure that always happened during the coalition. I hope Henry agrees. We were pretty good honouring when we said we would do something. We do.
No, and I think Jim has highlighted that, we're talking about building consensus, new politics. And I remember when I was First Minister going to visit your group to speak to them. They were a difficult bunch.
Yeah.
As we all are. But again, it was part of this, that was new. Speaking to the opposition. And of course the tuition fee thing was quite spectacular in a way, because we were not over enamoured with the idea, Jim's group was. But again, it was this question of talking to each other, trying to take it forward. But on a comical note, I remember we used to meet somewhere in the bowels of Edinburgh. There's a lot of bowels in Edinburgh. And witches were screaming, because it was the witches' tour underneath where we were. And I thought on reflection, that one might have been a better time compared with some of the arguments we had. But no, this was part and parcel of the new issues that were affecting the Parliament.
I just find it so fascinating to hear all about how you were working together. And Lorraine, on Geoff's point then, was there any feeling of disappointment that was what was required?
No, because I think Donald's great vision for the Parliament was that it should be governed by coalition. There'd been Labour dominance in Scotland for what felt like forever, and that needed to be broken. So he always saw, I think, where coalitions don't work, it's because the bigger party sees the smaller party as you're there to prop us up. Whereas Donald really genuinely understood and intellectually bought into the genuineness of what a coalition partnership really is. And I'm not sure that Labour in Westminster fully understood that, and there was a little bit of, Donald, you need to tell them. And Donald was like, no, this is a partnership. I don't tell them. And I don't think that first coalition could have happened and have happened the way it did if you didn't have Donald Dewar and Jim Wallace. I think that was the partnership, that was the two towering...
And the personal chemistry, we should say, was extraordinary.
Personal chemistry, integrity, trust.
Indeed.
It was that entire package that made it work, and I think Scotland was so lucky to have these two incredible politicians at that time in our political history.
Yeah, that's amazing. I want to just get a couple of minutes then, just as we kind of round off this, as I say, this era, on achievements of the Parliament. And Jim, I want to start with you, I think, because we're here to marking 25 years. What did the Parliament achieve in your time? What do you kind of look back on?
I think the biggest achievement was the ban on smoking in public places.
Right.
A GP in my constituency who said he hadn't supported the idea of the Scottish Parliament. He said that measure alone justified its whole existence. I think other things we did, and a lot of it, when we talk about consensus, a lot of it was consensual, because there was loads of Law Commission, Scottish Law Commission reports. We abolished the feudal system. We reformed the law of the tenement. We brought in land reform and the responsible right of access. We had a more robust freedom of information regime. And, I mean, things like we established national parks in Scotland. I've always thought it was ironic that the founder of national parks was a Scot, and the one country that didn't have any was Scotland until the coalition, until the first years of the Scottish Parliament. And therefore, there are a number of these things. And you were discussing free personal care earlier on. And we put substantial funding into higher and further education. And I think I always saw that as a quid pro quo for the tuition fees, is that higher education had to be properly funded. And that, I think, was the basis on which we went forward on that.
Henry, same question, achievements.
It seems to me the high point of the Parliament in its first 25 years has been the quality of some of the legislation. There's 2 points. One is at Westminster, when we were there as MPs, we might have had 1 bill, 2 bills about Scotland, because it was a tight regime down there. But over the last 20 odd years, we've had nearly 300 bills in the Scottish Parliament. And that was about Scottish issues. And because we talked about personal care, tuition fees, in terms of Alex Salmond's leadership, we had minimum unit pricing of alcohol under Nicola's, and of course under Jack, with the ban on smoking in public places. We were the 4th country in the world, or nation, as they would like to refer to it at Westminster, who passed that legislation. So I think that if we're looking at a real success story, with all the other limitations we talked about, legislation in Scotland, and Donald was responsible for issues such as land reform, with a united Parliament, including the Liberals, and there was a whole raft of areas that had been neglected by virtue of the fact that we were at Westminster and time was not on our side. And that, I think, has to endure as we describe other parts of the devolution.
Lorraine?
I just think that we have been so blessed in this era, and there's so much we talk about Donald's, but I think it was Donald's vision for the Parliament, and it was just so sad that he died when he did, and we didn't have time to embed some of the non-tribal issues that Wendy talked about, like the committee system and how he saw that working. That hasn't worked the way that it should have worked. His policy agenda, I think, would absolutely have developed. I think he had a clear idea about he was going to come in. He didn't want the Parliament to run before it could walk. He wanted to embed those principles. And then that younger, ambitious, creative dynamic generation that were coming in, the Wendys and Susan Deacons of this world, to be able to flourish and go on to achieve all the things that they did. But I think, you know, having Donald and having Jim has been one of the greatest successes of the devolution era.
I mean, Lorraine mentioned the committee system, and there's also a thing when Henry said coming to meet the Liberal Democratic group, we were a tough lot. People used to say, how is the committee system different? I mean, I remember appearing before committees. And I tell you, I got as much hassle from my own members, I mean, mostly Liberal Democrats, but also Labour members in committees, than I did from the opposition. And that's how I thought it was going to work. And that's how we intended it should work. They were all, I mean, committees, as Henry will remember, committees in Westminster, public bill committees, the government members were just sitting right their their constituency correspondence. Whereas in Holyrood, everyone took part.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure that free flow and lack of whips actually persisted.
Yeah. Wendy, I've just got 30 seconds for achievements of the Parliament.
Okay, so I think the social agenda mattered after 20 years. So you had 100 new schools built. There was consensus on housing legislation in Scotland. There was now free transport for pensioners. Now, one of the questions is, does bus passes remain a good or a bad thing 25 years on? I don't know, but 25 years ago, it was a good thing. Free personal care, people have touched on housing. So there was a whole raft, and the final one was using the windfall tax on modern apprenticeships. So these areas that were areas of partnership that led to significant social advance that we've kind of lost now because it's 25 years ago.
Interesting. Can I just say, we could spend hours talking to you all, and perhaps we will do that in future podcast episodes. We're trying to take a big run through these 25 years. We're very grateful for you guys guiding us through. Thank you all so much. Thank you.
For watching, press subscribe and you'll get all the best videos offering insight on Scottish politics delivered straight to your feed. Press subscribe and stick around, and if you'd like to hear our conversations in full, open up your podcast app and search for Holyrood Sources.